about the many nights of rock and roll I spent in my youth. Hardcore. My grandma taught me how to rock. She hummed Elvis while she hemmed my pants. She liked Elvis. She liked him so much that she bought me a black leather jacket with zippers and a motorcycle hat like Marlon Brando. That really honked off Mrs. Taylor. She kicked me out of first grade. She said I'd be a bad influence on all the other kids. You know, like those snotty-nosed kids anyway. They couldn't rock like Grandma. You ain't nothing but a hound dog, but crying all the time. You ain't nothing but a hound dog, baby, crying all the time. Well, you ain't never caught a rabbit and you ain't no friend of mine. Well, you thought you so high. Well, that was just a lie. You thought you're so high class, baby. Well, that was just a lie. Well, you ain't never caught a rabbit and you ain't no friend of mine. You ain't nothing but a hound dog. You're crying all the time. You ain't nothing but no hound dog, baby, crying all the time. Well, you ain't never caught a rabbit, you ain't no friend of mine. So that's how this story starts. I was 4 years old. My grandmother bought me this album. My grandmother, as the poem just said, loved Elvis. I started listening to that record over and over again before even kindergarten. Grandma loved Elvis. That would be like your grandmother's loving Metallica now. So I listened to that until the record wore thin. I listened to the Ink Spots, the Mills Brothers. Those were all Grandma's favorites, kind of predecessors of R&B. Then I got into the 7th grade, into the 2nd grade, and I'm still very much influenced by Elvis, but I have these feelings inside of me that start to sort of bubble up, and then they end up in the pages of my textbook. Grandma gets a call. She has to come and pay for the textbooks. I get yelled at. I have no clue what I'm doing. I'm a working class kid raised by grandparents. My grandfather worked on the assembly line for 33 years at Dodge, Maine. So Elvis was my Shakespeare, my opera, my film. Elvis was everything, and as was Grandma. So at 7, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm writing these things down, and I eventually go through 3rd grade, 4th grade, get to 5th grade, really weird year. A couple of significant things happen in the 5th grade at the age of 10. The president's assassinated, that's one thing, in November. Also from Mr. Wadkey, I learned in that big fat book that you used to have with the hardcover on it, always had a pelican sitting on a post looking at a bay. It's called Literature. Mr. Wadkey said that some of the things in this book were called poems. I'd never heard of poems before. But I did know that what I saw on the pages of that in some guy, Edgar Allan Poe or something, had a lot of white space. And I knew what I was doing had a lot of white space. So just before Christmas, once again, Grandma loved music, rock and roll music. Had the radio on, we're driving down Gratiot Avenue. On the radio comes the next thing that's going to turn my world upside down totally. The guy says, "Here's the Beatles!"
1, 2, 3, 4.
Now the world is upside down. I looked at the little black and white television set that we used to watch our little shows on, and when those guys appeared, I saw them. We didn't know who they were, but they flashed the names of each person. And what I noticed was the guy who held his guitar kind of high and stood kind of like this. I didn't know who he was, but I liked what I was hearing. And I said, I don't know who that guy is, but whoever he is, I want some of that. That guy was John Lennon. Sorry, girls, he was married, it said. So now I'm writing poetry. Mr. Wadke said it was. I believe Mr. Wadke. 6th grade, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th. I'm still writing this stuff. I get into the beginning of high school, just the very beginning of it. Grandma gives me a record again for Christmas. It's called The Doors. Start listening to this music over and over again. I like it. Sounds good. I don't know what poetry is, but it sounds like a guy is reading poetry. And then there was a track on Strange Days, if you know that record. The track was called Horses Latitudes, and it was, who I later learned is Jim Morrison, reciting a poem with music. I knew I was writing poetry. I knew I loved music. So in 67, 68, I decided I'm going to tell all the kids in the neighborhood who I grew up with that I wrote poetry. This was a big thing. Working class kids didn't write poetry. Only certain people might have written poetry then, but not us. I heard this guy, Jim Morrison. 5 and 1, baby, 1 and 5. No one here gets it out of line. You get yours, baby, I'll get mine. Get together one more time. Get together one more time. Get together one more time. So Grandma drove me up Jefferson Avenue to Coble Hall. Must have only been 12. This is kind of crazy. And she let me out with money for bus fare to go see this group called The Doors at Coble Hall. Then I knew what poetry was. So I started thinking that it was very unusual for people like me to write poetry. And I thought if I could understand poetry or write poetry, everybody could do this. They had to. Everybody was smarter than me. They had to do that. So I thought, how can I make this point to people? How can I bring this across? Well, it was during and at the very end of high school, I started thinking, well, one is I can put music with poetry, kind of like this, and I could maybe facilitate and start what would be called workshops and try to put poetry into the community in a serious way. So I went over to Chicago where I started doing national poetry for the first time. And while I was there, a friend of mine by the name of Koresh, who worked for Poets and Writers, he said, we're doing a big reading with some orphan kids on the north side who have been in a writing workshop all summer. He said, I want you to come. So I said, sure. By then I knew I was a poet. I write poetry. I'm trying to get poetry across to everyday people. So he took me in this room. There weren't many people. And these young kids got up and started reading their work. Went through the whole list of them. One kid, he must have been 11 or 12, got up. And he read this poem about his mother. He didn't really know because she'd been incarcerated most of his life. But he ended that poem and he said, my mother my mother, I love you. And that did something to me, sitting in that darkened Harold Washington Civic Center in downtown Chicago in the Loop. I don't think I was really the same after that, because I thought poetry is important to people. Poetry can save lives. Poetry can change lives. It did mine. It obviously did that kid that day. So I came back to Detroit and started to organize poetry events and poetry readings. Eventually that led to poetry workshops, but I didn't want to just do them in an academic sense. I wanted them to be in the community and serving people who would never in a million years have a moment to hear a poem or write a poem or even think that poetry was important. So I did come back and I started a program. I had poets, one, making some money, which was, it still is pretty rare, but I had them working at mental health facilities with Vietnam veterans and domestic abuse shelters, in youth homes, in prisons, even in hospitals. Everyday people writing poetry that may end up saving their lives. So that continued on, continues on to this day. I found finally these wonderful musicians, brought them together, took my poetry and started matching it with original music. So now in 2015 it sounds like this.
1, 2, 3, 4.
So from Elvis to the Beatles to Jim Morrison to this original stuff, the train is your blood, pulling everything up. By the roots as you shine, by the roots as you shine, one last time, like a coin being tossed into a fountain, like a coin being tossed into a fountain, like a coin being tossed into a fountain, blue, blue fountain, yeah. Well, the train, it's your blood, yeah. Somewhere you may rust, waiting to change this the whole wide world. Somewhere you may rust, while you're waiting to change this whole wide world that doesn't accept any movement, cause it knows so very little, knows so little about standing still. Will the train, that's your blood, it's your blood, yeah. Frankie! Yeah, the train, it's your blood, yeah. Somewhere you may rust, waiting to change this the whole wide world. Somewhere you may rust, while you're waiting to change this whole wide world that doesn't accept any movement, accept any Yeah, the trade. It's your blood. It's your blood, yeah. That's how we do TED Talks in Detroit. Thank you. Tony Muggs, Leonard Wilkins on the drums, and Frankie the K from the Urban Studies and Labor Studies program, and Charlie Palazola on guitar. Thank you.